Hi, this is Max with The Way of the Elbow Rolfing. I would like to follow up on the last videos that I've made, again on the occasion of this corona pandemic that we're all currently doing our best to manage. I suppose we can count ourselves lucky that in 2020 that we're able to maintain some contact with one another through the internet, through electronic media. Obviously, it's not the same thing as face-to-face communication, but it's something of a temporary substitute, and it's a way that I found at least to maintain some kind of communication with my patients and clients, and so I've been trying to take advantage of it. In this video, I would like to, in some way, continue with an exploration of themes that have been that will be familiar from the last videos. But like before, I hope that what I say can inspire a little, some new ways of thinking about these things that might seem familiar, or they might seem like new ideas. Either way, I think my hope is the same. It's that what I say can help carry them forward. This video I would like to, so to begin with, I'll just sort of reiterate where we're coming from to now, and then there are a few things that I would like to add to the picture that we've started to create. The kind of basic question is, and in some ways it's a single question, but it's almost impossible to express it as a single question. It's like we have to ask many different questions to get at this really single one, which is the kind of pith kernel of the question. But it's something to do with what is Rolfing, what is the body, right? What is our life? Well, to think about this, I tried to at least give us three principles to start to think about it, at least, according to the way that the paradigm of Rolfing and specifically the way of the elbow. To reiterate these three principles from the first video, it was the first one I called adaptability. And one way of thinking about adaptability is just the notion of the body as not as a chunk of matter or stuff. Rather, the body as something that's in continual transformation, continually changing. The body as a verb, right? Not as just a thing. The second principle that I introduced in the first video, I called this one gravity, or gravitation. But I also observed that we should really think of gravitation as something like a name or a metonym, in the same way that you might call a king by the crown that the king wears. You might say the crown did this, and then the crown did that. Well, so we might say that gravity this, gravity that. In fact, we're using gravity to designate all of the total environment that we live in and have our being in and move in. This is the reason the reason it's important is because many reasons that it's important. One of them, though, in some ways the most fundamental reason, is it's really inconceivable to imagine our own being and our own lives without the environment with which, and without everything that's so-called not us, without everything that we're in continual relation with. So this I called gravity, but again, I hope that it encompasses much more than that. Another way of thinking of this is in the same way that a verb or a word will find itself always in a sentence, the context of a sentence. Or we can think of our own being and our own selves. We're always in a context of meaning. So this was the second principle. The third principle is what I called holism. And I use this term to to just try to bring to light or indicate this really crucial distinction that is absolutely necessary to make if we want to have an accurate picture of where we're starting from and what we're trying to accomplish. It's the distinction between living things and mechanical objects. And I try to approach the distinction through differentiating between parts and wholes, or components and wholes, and moments and wholes. And often it can be useful to think of the body as anatomical, to conceptualize the body anatomically, which is to say, a collection of parts, right? Collection of anatomy. And so then we imagine that you cobble the parts together and there you have a body. This is obviously true for something like a chair, right, or an automobile, right? So if you assemble the engine and the chassis and the wheels, etc., and you put them together in the right way, you will end up with a car. But now that's obviously not. It could be further from the case with a living thing. There's just no way to imagine putting. It's like the story of Frankenstein's monster, to imagine cobbling together these things. And the point is, at least for now, that's science fiction. In the last video, I used the analogy of an apple plant. I had an apple seed. We have to say rather that there's no way to imagine setting together the parts of an apple tree or fruit or whatever it happens to be, because rather each one of those things, it's not a part exactly, it's a moment, right? Instead we have to think of in some way the whole of the apple, both spatially, even when it's at its maximal extension, extended in space, right? And the seed is kind of the opposite pole of that. It's maximally intensive in the seed. But we have to imagine somehow all of the extension, the parts that are expressed in when it happens to be July or August or September, whichever season we imagine to be the maximal extension, whether it's the blossom phase or the fruit phase. But we have to imagine all of those parts there, expressed in the apple tree. They, in some way, they flow forth, or they are expressions of this whole that's contained intensively in the seed. And so it's really a reversal or an inversion between something living and something mechanical. Something mechanical, we assemble the parts and kind of impose the whole from the outside. It's somebody's idea, like the idea of a chair. In a living thing, the parts, they are expressions of the whole. They flow forth from the whole precedes the parts, right? So we were all embryos once, and then all of our features, they kind of flow forth from the single cell that begins to divide it and articulate and differentiate. I also use to again try to illustrate these three principles in action, so to speak. I use the analogy of a river, and again this helps to see how the body is at once a static thing, but also a dynamic thing, and if we picture the river, we see the river has a source and it has a mouth, and the river is flow, but the river itself doesn't flow. In other words, the water flows through the river, but the river has to remain in some way, has to abide. That's how I'm arguing that's a much more accurate way to think about our bodies, not as objects or chunks of matter so much as patterns, right? In the same way that we could think of the river as a pattern. because the river is not just the river bed, and it's clearly not the water that's flowing through it, because then it would be a new river every time the water flowed through. But it's some way the pattern of all of those things together. And I'm trying to, I suppose, present the picture of the body as something analogous to the river in that respect. I also, in this video, I would like to sort of say one way in which those analogies are very fitting, one further way. So on top of the reasons that I've already tried to present them as useful to help us conceptualize the body, I would like to add one way in which I think they're helpful analogies, but in fact, in some way, the reason for making this video was that I would also like to point out one way in which they could be misleading. But so first, I'll explore a way in which they are helpful, and by helpful I mean they can help us to perceive something that otherwise might escape our notice. So they can help us to perceive something that might otherwise just go past us. This is related to the idea of, like, why is it worth thinking about these things? What good does it do to try to understand what we're attempting to accomplish in Rolfing therapy, for example? And if you're someone who wants kind of a tangible, concrete benefits that you can measure, then I tried to offer several of them in the last video. Why it would be useful to think about these ideas, and I'm going to try to carry forward that notion, and I'll use both the apple tree and the river to try to show why it does matter, and in a basic way, it matters because it's really there's no way to we have to know where we have to have an accurate diagnosis of what we're beginning with if we have any expectation of developing or carrying out effective therapy or effective intervention. It doesn't make sense to imagine we might get lucky, right? But really, to have a sort of systematic or methodical therapy, we need to know where we're beginning from, and that's why I think it's so important to have an accurate conception of what sort of thing the body is, what sort of thing Rolfing is, what sort of thing the world is, what sort of thing life is, etc. And if we picture either the tree or the river flowing, I think each of these in its own way can give us a picture of how this does matter, why this does matter. And to start with the river, you imagine that whatever happens to water at the source of the river up high in the mountain, whatever happens to the water up there, the water at the mouth of the river, by the time that water flows from the source to the mouth, it will have sort of, whatever happened to the water at the mouth it's the same water that eventually reaches I misspoke. Whatever happens to the water at the source is the same water that ultimately reaches the mouth. Right. So similarly, like with the apple tree, whatever are the conditions for the apple tree, as it's just a small shoot and then a little sapling. I'm thinking of the proper nourishment from sun and rain, etc. This influences and determines how the apple tree will grow from there. This is, in fact, it's every tree in the northern hemisphere, as a rule, will have more branches on the south-facing side, simply because the sun is over on that side. This just shows how the sun in some way draws the branches towards it, or the branches they reach towards the sun. And the sun is always in the south. The further north I'm in Alaska. The way of the elbow is located in Alaska. It's really obvious. You look at any tree and all of its branches are reaching towards the southern climes. The reason I say that is just because it gives a picture of how again, the environment and whatever is happening along the whole tree's life cycle. If you look at the tree at any single snapshot or any single moment of its life cycle, you will have, if you are looking at it in the proper way, it will reveal itself. But that single moment reveals itself to be a sort of a diagram of everything that's come before it. Right? So to really have a proper idea of where we're starting from in something like Rolfing therapy, we have to see that at any single moment, the way we present ourselves is a result or the fruit of everything that has come before, and it's also the seed of everything that will come after. And so this, once a clear picture of how of this kind of this diachronic or through time aspect of our bodies, it can be immensely helpful and illuminating in helping us to sort of determine what could be the most effective the most effective approach to therapy. And then it's simply a question of once we have a clear picture like that, a clear conception, a clear understanding of what we are trying to accomplish, then it's simply a question of me, for example, as a Rolfer, and then you as a client or patient. Then it's just a question of us coming up with what is the best way that we can work together to achieve that outcome that we both that goal that we both share. I would like to say why those are bad examples now, or bad analogies. The river and the tree. And by bad, I mean something very specific. It's that any analogy has to be both similar to what it's meant to be an analog of, but it also has to be different. If it's totally similar, if it's the same, then it's just the same thing, and it's not an analogy. It's just an identity. But if it's totally different, then it's not an analogy either, because it doesn't help you to see any kind of connections, right? So what I mean by bad is simply a way in which these analogies are. It's an important difference between these analogies and what we're really working with, which is our own bodies and our own selves and our own biographies. This important and really essential difference, and in fact, kind of the reason that I made this particular video is to emphasize this difference. It's that both in the case of the river and in the case of the apple tree or any tree, neither one of those things is taking initiative or responsibility for its progress, for its development. In fact, it's almost grotesque or strange to apply the term like initiative or responsibility to an apple tree or to a river. Something like initiative or responsibility or resolution, these terms just don't belong with, or these ideas don't belong with the ideas of apple tree and river. The same could not be said about our own lives and our own selves, which is what we're working with in something like Rolfing. Quite on the contrary, we have the possibility to really do take our own development in hand and guide it in a way that we think is the proper course of development. This is, again, it's fundamentally different than thinking about the analogies that I presented. And again, part of the work in Rolfing is basically finding a way in which, for me, it's a question of finding a way in which I can support you and we can work together towards that kind of development. With that, I will conclude this video. I hope that what I said can just again, like in the previous videos, I hope that I can help us to see things in a little bit different ways, reveal more further dimensions in things that we already maybe think are familiar, or it will introduce entirely new ideas, and then we start with those. So I will thank everyone for your presence and wish you the best until next time.